Hello everyone! Today we are going to be talking about the birds and the bees. Well, kind of. We're talking about plant reproduction. We will be talking about asexual plant reproduction, sexual plant reproduction, as well as succession. Now with today's lesson we have a few goals in mind. The first goal is to be able to compare and contrast the pros and cons of asexual and sexual reproduction. We have talked about the pros and cons of asexual and sexual reproduction in the past. If you can, pause the video and see if you can remember any. You should also know some of the forms of asexual reproduction. Again, you might actually know some, or have asexually reproduced plants in your house. You should know the basic differences between the gymnosperms and the angiosperm reproductive structures. One has cones, one has flowers. You should know the reproductive structures of the angiosperms. We're going to go into the different parts of that. You should know the basic life cycle of gymnosperms and angiosperms. That's a bit of a revision because we have gone into it before. And you should know the differences between primary and secondary succession. But let's get into it. The first thing we're going to talk about is asexual reproduction in seed plants. Now, there's a number of different structures on plants that allow for asexual reproduction. So one example is the stem. And so if we have modified stems, sometimes they can asexually reproduce. So up here, we actually have an example of a rhizome. That's a term we've talked about in terms of modified stems in a previous lesson. And what you can see is this is the rhizome, that modified stem, and out of it we get sprouting vascular plants. So we have asexual reproduction happening. The other thing is we can have modified leaves. And so over here you have a kalanchoe, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, and on each leaf it actually creates little tiny baby plants, and you can pick them off and plant them basically. And of course you can also grow plants from fragments of roots or shoots, and I'm sure you've seen this been done or have done it yourself, where you cut off the top of the green onions and put them in some water. You can do the same thing with lettuce and onions, pineapple. So there's lots of vegetables and sort of fruits and things that you can actually do that with. Now you'll notice there's a few different TikToks that I've posted here. I do encourage you to go watch them. They show you exactly what is happening with some of these structures, and they're kind of neat to watch. So those are the different types of asexual reproduction you can get, and asexual reproduction does have some pros and cons. The first pro is that it doesn't have to have any specialized structures. It doesn't need reproductive organs in order to allow it to occur. You also only need one plant, which means you don't have to worry about finding another plant to reproduce with. You only need one. And because there's already sort of a viable, robust creature, organism, then there's a higher survival rate. The biggest con is that there's a lack of genetic diversity or variation, because any babies will have the same genetics as the parent plant. And this is really dangerous if the environment changes, because a greater diversity ensures that the population is better able to survive. So lots of plants will actually produce asexually as well as sexually. Humans have a lot of use for asexual reproduction. I've already talked about how we can sort of regrow produce that we have used up, whether it's green onions or carrots or onions, whatever. But we can also graft things together. Oops-a-daisy. We can graft things. And so grafting is a technique used in orchards and vineyards to attach the sort of stems of one plant onto another. And you can see that over there. There's some really interesting TikToks on this as well that you're going to have to search for yourself. And you can also cut stems. And so some of the TikToks on the previous page talked about this. And so people will actually propagate plants from their own plants. It takes a bit of time, but it's pretty rewarding. That's it for asexual reproduction. Now we're going to talk about sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction, the pros and cons of it are sort of the flip of asexual. So the biggest pro is that we're getting that genetic diversity, which means they're going to be better able to survive if there's environmental changes. Another pro is that seeds can travel, which means you're creating offspring in areas that you're not going to be competing with. You're not going to be competing for resources like water or nutrients. And that's positive because it means you're more likely to survive and your offspring is more likely to survive. And remember, the goal of life for an organism is to produce offspring that can survive. The other thing is seeds can remain dormant. So if the environment isn't good, if it's too dry, too cold, whatever, then seeds can just kind of hang out and can grow or germinate once environmental conditions are better for it. The biggest con is that you have to devote resources, so sugar and nutrients and water, to actually creating those reproductive structures, whether it's cones or flowers. What you'll see happening is when environmental conditions for reproduction are bad, this flowering or cone making may not always happen because the tree might not have the resources to devote to making these reproductive structures. If you recall, our gymnosperms, our reproductive structures are cones. And so our gymnosperms are our cone-bearing vascular plants. And they're going to have female cones and they're going to have male cones. And that male cone is going to release pollen that will or can enter the female cone and make its way to the ovule. And this pollination occurs through wind. And so pollen is going to scatter off into the wind and reach another cone, female cone. Now, if you recall, we have spoken about the life cycle of a gymnosperm in the past. And we're going to take a little review of it. So let's start at the tree. We have a happy little tree, vascular, and there's two types of cones. We have a female cone that's going to be containing the sort of female reproductive parts, so the ovule, and we have a male cone that's going to be containing the male reproductive parts, so the pollen. So just like in humans, gymnosperms have gametes. So human gametes are sperm and egg. Gymnosperm gametes are pollen and are egg. And that egg is found in the megaspore. And so these gametes, the pollen and the egg, are going to be haploid, which means half the set of chromosomes. And that means that at this stage in life, the organism is considered to be in their gametophyte generation. And so the pollen and the egg are going to meet, and they're going to fertilize, and we will end up with a zygote. This zygote will produce a seed, and the seed can then germinate in the ground, and we end up with a happy little plant. You will notice that there is more blue than red, and that is just showing you that gymnosperms spend most of their lifetime as in the sporophyte generation, which means they are diploid or have a full arsenal of chromosomes. And it's only for a period of time when they are haploid or have half the number of chromosomes. Here's another image of the same thing. In some ways I like this image a bit better because it's easier to see how the male cone right here produces pollen. And so we have our pollen grains down here, and our female cone up here is going to be producing the megaspore. And if we look at the megaspore in here, we actually have our eggs. And so the pollen is going to enter the megaspore, fertilize the eggs, and then we are going to end up with a zygote, which produces a seed, which can result in a full-grown plant. And so those, the pollen and the egg are haploid, or half the number of chromosomes, and result in a fertilized zygote, which is now diploid. If we move on to angiosperms, you may recall that angiosperms are plants that flower. And the result of pollination of these flowers are going to be fruit, and this fruit will contain seeds. Flowers are actually the sexual reproductive organs of angiosperms. So humans have certain sexual reproductive organs, so do flowers. If you recall from earlier on in this lesson, we mentioned that that was a con of sexual reproduction because flowers have to expend energy in order to produce these flowers, the specialized sexual reproductive organs. And so here's where the birds and the bees come in. Pollination occurs as a result of wind or animal. Animals are pollinators like the birds and the bees. Flowers tend to be very showy and colorful and scented because it helps to attract these animals. And there's two types of pollination. There's cross-pollination that occurs between two different plants, same species. And so you would have pollen from one plant meeting another plant. So that's cross-pollination. The other type of pollination is self-pollination, and that's where you actually have one plant, and pollen from one flower will go on to a flower on the same plant. So we have cross-pollination that involves two plants and self-pollination that involves one plant. So let's take a look at the reproductive structure of angiosperms, of our flowering plants. So here's what looks like a lily, and right off the bat, one structure that you would be very familiar with are the petals. And so the petals are usually colorful and scented in order to help attract pollinators, birds and the bees. The other structure that you may be familiar with is the sepal. The sepal is the sort of green structure that is around a flower bud. And so it just helps to protect that flower bud before it blooms. And after it blooms, you will see the sepal sort of around the petals. Now, one thing that's really interesting is many plants sprout bisexual flowers, so flowers that have both male and female reproductive organs. But some plants have separate flowers for male and female organs. For example, squash have a flower that produces the male reproductive organs and a flower that produces the female reproductive organs. So each plant is going to do this a little bit differently, but right now we are looking at a lily, and this lily has both female and male reproductive organs. Let's start out by looking at the female reproductive structure. The female reproductive structure is the pistil, and the pistil contains a few different parts. And the pistil is largely composed of everything you see here. So all of this right here, that's the pistil. And the first part is the stigma. So the stigma is that surface, and that surface contains sticky material, and this sticky material helps the pollen to stick to it. Next up, we have the style, and the style is just sort of the stalk that leads down to the ovary. If you're familiar with the human female reproductive system, the style is comparable to the fallopian tube. It's just a tube that leads to the ovary. Now, the ovary is this structure at the bottom. That's the ovary, and within the ovary, you're going to find an ovule, and an ovule contains an egg cell. So that egg cell is going to be haploid. It's the female haploid cell. That egg cell, once fertilized, will become a seed. So just to summarize, we have the stigma on top. That contains sticky stuff to help the pollen stick to it. We have our style, which is just a tube that leads to the ovary. Within the ovary, we have ovules, and the ovules are going to contain an egg cell. That egg cell will be able to fertilize with the male pollen, and eventually we get a seed. Okay, now let's look at the male reproductive structures. So the male reproductive structures are the stamen. And the stamen consists of different parts, just like the female reproductive structures did. The first part is the anther. And you can see the anther over here. On the anther is the anther is the thing that produces the pollen. And so, of course, that pollen is the sort of male reproductive cells, the sperm cells. So when you get an egg and a sperm together, they can fertilize and produce that seed. The other reproductive structure that is shown here is the filament. And the filament is just a stalk that holds the anther. And together, the anther, the filament, and the pollen compose the stamen, the male reproductive organs. So what will happen is you will get pollen from the anther that finds another flower. Either it's on the same plant in self-fertilization, or it's on a different plant in cross-pollination, and it's going to stick to the stigma. So that pollen stuck to the stigma is going to travel down the style in what's called the pollen tube, and it will enter the ovary, and it will meet up with an ovule. So the egg and the sperm will meet and can fertilize. Okay, so let's take a look at the angiosperm life cycle. We did just kind of talk about it. So here's our flower. This looks like an iris instead of a lily. And we have our anther that's going to be producing that sperm. So that's a male reproductive structure, the anther. And we have our ovary, part of the female reproductive structure. So on that anther, we're going to get our pollen, and the pollen is going to contain sperm. And the pollen will stick to our stigma, our sticky stigma. And that pollen grain will travel down the style and enter the ovary. Within the ovary is an egg. So we will get that sperm from the pollen meeting the egg in the ovule. So sperm and egg are going to be meeting in that ovule, which is in the ovary. They can then fertilize, which means they will become a zygote, which means they are 2N or diploid. So they are have a full set of chromosomes. As sperm, over here, our pollen, and egg, over here in our ovule, they were haploid, so they had half the number of chromosomes. They can fertilize and become full set of chromosomes from mom and dad plants. That zygote will produce a seed. The seed can then germinate, and then we get a happy little iris. Now, human uses of sexual reproduction of flowers: food. We eat food. There's so much food that we get from sexual reproduction of flowers, things like seeds, grain, fruit. And humans began to farm and have an agricultural system 10,000 years ago. And this move from hunter-gatherer to farming had a huge impact on civilization. We no longer had to be out hunting all day, and instead we had a lot more time on our hands for leisure activity, arts, and culture. So, like I said, being able to harness the power of plant sexual reproduction changed our civilization. Okay, so our final topic of the day is succession. The formal definition of succession is the gradual change over time in the species that form a community in a given area. Now, to me, that makes no sense. So, to me, the way that I see succession is like over time, biodiversity in an area will increase. So, over time, you'll get more plants, you'll get more animals, you'll get more insects, you'll get more biodiversity in a species. And so that's kind of how I understand succession. And there's two different types of succession. There's something called primary succession, which is where that biodiversity is increasing in an area that is completely barren. Like there's nothing there. It's rock, and that's it. It's rock. And so primary succession will always begin with a pioneer species, which just means the first to colonize an area. So it's the first thing that's going to begin living on that rock. So an example of a pioneer species is lichen. If you recall from a previous lesson, lichen is a composite species composing of cyanobacteria or algae and a fungi. Now, lichen don't need soil in order to acquire nutrients. And this is important because we have our fungi, which means they're decomposers, and they're going to decompose externally to their body. And so what these lichen do is they're going to secrete acids and other enzymes and things that will help to erode rock. And this erosion helps to form soil. And the soil allows other organic matter to begin growing and living in that space. So primary succession is in a place that is completely barren. Imagine just rocks, no soil, no shade, nothing, and begins with a pioneer species. Secondary succession, however, is when there has previously been an ecosystem in an area. So things have used to live there, but then something happened. The ecosystem was disturbed, either through a natural event or a human activity. Can you think of any natural events or human activities that would completely wipe out an ecosystem? Pause the video. Can you think of anything? So I hope you took the time to pause the video and give it a thought. As far as natural events, I wouldn't be surprised if you said forest fire. There are some other natural events that can cause a disturbance in the community, like floods, violent storms like tornadoes or hurricanes. And there's also human activities that can cause a disturbance. Clear cutting of forests, so where we go and whack down all the trees, that causes a huge disturbance. And sometimes we do that to harvest the materials, and sometimes we're just clearing land for agriculture or construction of roads or buildings. And so together these natural or human activities wipe out the ecosystem. Secondary succession occurs after one of these events. And unlike primary succession, there's already organic matter that exists. There's going to be some sort of soil. There will often be the remains of whatever organic matter was there before. For example, in a forest fire, you're going to see the burnt up trees in the space. And often, hiding in the soil, you will find plants and fungi that are they're still sticking around, hiding out in the soil, just waiting for a good time to emerge. Regardless of whether it's primary or secondary succession, biodiversity will increase over time. So let's take a look at a primary succession. Like I said, primary succession is in the event where we have barren land. And on that barren land, we will get our pioneer species, which is usually lichens. This sets up the opportunity to create soil and other required nutrients and elements for other species. So you will get animals, small animals, sometimes large, that will come and eat lichen. For example, caribou eat lichen. And over time, you'll get more plants, small plants, grasses, things like that, which will eventually allow for larger plants, shrubs, and things like that, until eventually we have large shade-tolerant trees. And you can just see over time, the biodiversity increases. And as a result, you're also having other diversity, like structural diversity and genetic diversity within a space. It's important to know that succession can take a really long time. Here we have an image of secondary succession. Notice that it starts out with some sort of disturbance to the ecosystem. In this case, we have a forest fire. And that has resulted in the organisms being wiped out. This type of succession is usually takes less time because that organic matter already exists. The plant life is hanging out in the soil, waiting to come out again. And, well, the soil already exists. So that is all for the birds and the bees, or reproduction of plants. Just a reminder, we talked about asexual reproduction, so some of the ways that that can happen, as well as the pros and cons of it. We talked about sexual reproduction, some differences between gymnosperms and angiosperms in terms of reproductive structures, cones versus flowers, and also their cycle. Their cycles are comparable, but again, with differences in the reproductive structures, where both are sporophyte generation dominant, which means they spend most of their lifetime in as diploid organisms, so they have that full set of chromosomes. And then we talked about flowers and the reproductive structures, the male structures and the female structures, and how the pollen from the male structures can enter the pistil female reproductive structures. And then we talked about succession and the differences between primary and secondary succession. But that's it for now. As always, if you have questions, please let me know, and good luck.